The clipboard felt heavier than it should have in Jessica's lap. She sat outside the flight briefing room, watching officers stream past her like she was part of the furniture. The door behind her remained closed, sealing away the voices of pilots who belonged at that table. Her name wasn't on the flight roster anymore. It hadn't been for 3 weeks. Most of the crew assumed she'd washed out entirely. One bad simulation, they whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. One moment of poor judgment, and now she was relegated to the back seat with a patch that read, "Observer, non-certified," in block letters just below her name tag. The aircraft carrier hummed beneath her feet, a constant reminder that life aboard the USS Constellation moved forward whether she was part of it or not. Yellow-vested deck crews scurried past, their boots echoing off the metal corridors. The smell of jet fuel and salt air drifted through the ventilation system, mixing with the sterile scent of regulation cleaning supplies. Jessica adjusted her flight suit and checked her watch. The morning briefing would end soon, and she'd be assigned to whatever aircraft needed an observer. Usually, it meant sitting in the back seat while some hotshot pilot showed off, treating her like a tourist with a headset. Lieutenant Commander Bradley emerged from the briefing room, his swagger evident even in the narrow corridor. He was everything the Navy wanted in a pilot: confident, quick-witted, and blessed with the kind of natural charm that made instructors overlook minor mistakes. His flight suit looked freshly pressed, sleeves rolled to show off his watch, a gift from his father who'd flown in Desert Storm. "Morning, Jessica," he said, his tone carrying just enough sympathy to sting. "Hope you're ready for some real flying today. We're taking up Bird 509 for a routine patrol. Should be smooth sailing." She nodded without speaking. What was there to say? That she'd memorized every system on the FA-18 Super Hornet? That she'd studied fault trees and emergency procedures until her eyes burned? That she could fly circles around half the pilots who still had their wings? The walk to the flight deck felt longer than usual. Other crew members barely acknowledged her presence, their attention focused on the controlled chaos of flight operations. She passed 2 ordnance technicians who didn't bother hiding their glances. One nudged the other and whispered something that made them both chuckle. The word "tourist" carried clearly over the engine noise. Jessica kept her expression neutral. She'd learned not to react to the comments, the sideways looks, the assumption that she was somehow less capable because she'd been pulled from active duty. The official report had used clinical language: insufficient confidence in emergency procedures, and delayed decision-making under pressure. What it really meant was that she'd tried to save an aircraft instead of following protocol and ejecting. The incident replayed in her mind as she climbed the ladder to the cockpit. The simulation had been brutal. A night carrier landing with multiple system failures, adverse weather, and a fuel emergency. When the hook missed the arrestor cable and the instructor screamed for her to eject, she'd calculated her options in seconds. The aircraft was still flyable. She had enough fuel for one more pass. She could bring it down safely. But that wasn't what they wanted to hear. They wanted compliance, not creativity. They wanted pilots who followed the book, not ones who wrote their own chapters. The rear cockpit of the FA-18 smelled like hydraulic fluid and hot metal. Jessica settled into her seat and began running through her mental checklist, even though no one had asked her to. Electrical systems, altimeter alignment, fuel flow indicators. She checked them all with the precision of someone who genuinely cared about the aircraft's well-being. Lieutenant Commander Bradley hoisted himself into the front seat, whistling a tune she didn't recognize. He toggled his microphone before completing his pre-flight checks, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the sky. "Tower, this is Hornet 509, ready for morning patrol," he announced. "Got my observer in the back seat, so we'll keep it interesting." Jessica tightened her harness and said nothing. Her job was to watch and learn, not to contribute. The irony wasn't lost on her that she probably knew more about the aircraft systems than most of the pilots who still had their wings. But knowledge without authority was just expensive education. As the catapult prepared to launch them into the morning sky, Jessica caught her reflection in the canopy glass. She looked like any other naval aviator, helmet secured, gloves on, ready for whatever the day might bring. But appearances, she'd learned, could be deceiving. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the carrier's edge, gray-green swells that seemed to mirror the uncertainty of her future. Somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of ocean and sky, lay the answer to a question she'd been afraid to ask. Would she ever get another chance to prove herself? The catapult engaged with a violent lurch, pressing her back into her seat as the FFA-18 screamed off the deck and into the morning haze. For a moment, despite everything, Jessica smiled. Whatever happened next, she was flying again. 21,000 feet above the Pacific, Jessica monitored the aircraft systems with the focused attention of someone who had nothing else to do. The morning patrol was routine, a simple navigation exercise that any first-year pilot could handle in their sleep. Lieutenant Commander Bradley flew with the lazy confidence of someone who'd done this run 100 times before. "Beautiful day up here," Bradley's voice crackled through the intercom. "Visibility's perfect, weather's calm. Almost makes you forget we're getting paid to do this." Jessica watched the multifunction displays, noting small irregularities that Bradley seemed to miss. Their roll into the next waypoint was shallow. He hadn't compensated for the wind vector that had shifted 5 degrees since takeoff. The fuel flow to the port engine was running slightly rich, nothing dangerous, but inefficient. She made mental notes of everything, a habit that had served her well in training. "You see anything interesting back there?" Bradley asked, his tone suggesting he expected nothing more than a tourist's observations. "Systems are green," Jessica replied simply. There was no point in mentioning the minor inefficiencies. Her job was to observe, not to critique. The radio chatter was light, other aircraft checking in with the tower. Weather updates, routine communications that painted a picture of a perfectly normal morning. Jessica found herself relaxing slightly, letting the familiar rhythm of flight operations wash over her. Maybe this assignment wouldn't be so bad after all. That thought lasted exactly 37 seconds. The change was subtle at first. Bradley's radio responses became slightly delayed, his voice losing some of its casual confidence. His hand on the throttle seemed less steady, small corrections that suggested he was fighting to maintain his heading. "You okay up there?" Jessica asked, leaning forward to get a better look at the front seat. No response. Bradley's helmet remained motionless, his shoulders rigid in a way that suggested something was very wrong. "Bradley?" Jessica tried again, louder this time. "Are you reading me?" Still nothing. The aircraft continued on its programmed course, but Jessica could see that Bradley's left hand had slipped from the throttle grip. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and his breathing, what she could see of it, appeared shallow and irregular. Training kicked in before conscious thought. Jessica's hands moved to her own controls, fingers dancing across switches and buttons with practiced precision. She'd studied every emergency procedure for the FA-18, memorized every system backup and failure mode. The knowledge she'd accumulated during months of ground school and simulated training suddenly became very relevant. "Tower, this is Hornet 509, she transmitted, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Front seat pilot is unresponsive, back seat taking control." The response came immediately, sharp with disbelief. "Say again, 5-0-9. You're not cleared for flight control." Jessica had already taken the stick. The aircraft responded smoothly to her input, leveling out under her guidance. The trim felt slightly tail-heavy. Bradley had been overcorrecting for the wind shear without realizing it. She made the necessary adjustments with small, precise movements. "Tower, I have aircraft control," she repeated, her voice steady. "Front seat pilot appears to be experiencing some kind of medical emergency. Requesting medical support on deck and emergency landing clearance." A different voice came through the radio, this one belonging to someone with considerably more authority. "Negative, 509. You are not authorized to operate that aircraft. Maintain current heading and altitude until we can vector assistance." Jessica checked her instruments. Fuel was adequate for now, but Bradley's inefficient flying had cost them more than necessary. Weather conditions were deteriorating slightly. Not dangerous, but not ideal either. Every minute they delayed was a minute closer to potential complications. "Copy, Tower," she acknowledged. "But I need to inform you that the pilot is completely unresponsive. I'm not sure what kind of assistance you're planning to vector, but I'm the only one up here who can fly this aircraft right now." The silence that followed was telling. Jessica could almost hear the frantic conversations taking place in the tower, the rapid consultations with flight operations, the calls to medical personnel. She just created a situation that probably wasn't covered in anybody's manual. While they figured out what to do with her, Jessica continued to monitor Bradley's condition. His breathing remained shallow but steady. His pulse, what she could see of it, appeared regular. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was definitely incapacitating. She ran through her options. The aircraft was performing normally, all systems green. She had enough fuel for a standard approach and landing. The weather, while not perfect, was well within acceptable parameters. The only complication was the fact that she wasn't supposed to be flying the aircraft in the first place. 509. "This is Commander Peterson." A new voice came through the radio. "What's your flight experience in the FAA team?" Jessica almost laughed. "Over 200 hours in simulator, sir. Plus ground school and systems training. I know this aircraft." "Simulator time doesn't count as flight experience, 509. "With respect, sir, it's flight experience I have right now. Unless you've got another pilot up here I don't know about." Another pause. Jessica could practically hear the wheels turning, the rapid calculations of risk versus protocol. She'd put them in an impossible position, and everyone knew it. "Stand by, 509. Commander Peterson finally said. "We're working on a solution." Jessica settled back in her seat, one hand light on the stick, the other monitoring Bradley's vital signs through the aircraft's biometric sensors. The Pacific stretched endlessly below them, beautiful and indifferent to the drama playing out at 21,000 feet. Whatever solution they came up with, she'd be ready for it. She'd been preparing for this moment, or one like it, for months. The only question was whether they'd let her prove she was ready, or whether protocol would trump common sense. Either way, she was flying again. And for the first time in weeks, Jessica felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The holding pattern felt eternal. Jessica had been flying circles above the Pacific for 43 minutes while the brass figured out what to do with her. Lieutenant Commander Bradley remained unconscious in the front seat, his breathing steady but shallow. The aircraft's medical monitoring system showed stable vital signs, but whatever had happened to him wasn't resolving itself. 509, this is Tower Control. The radio crackled. "We're vectoring a chase plane to your location. Lieutenant Hayes will assess the situation and provide guidance." Jessica's jaw tightened. She knew Tommy Hayes from training, a competent pilot, but hardly the most experienced in the squadron. The fact that they were sending him instead of someone with more flight hours said everything about how seriously they were taking her capabilities. "Copy, Tower. We'll maintain current position and altitude." 20 minutes later, the chase plane appeared off her starboard wing. Jessica could see Hayes in the cockpit, his helmet turning as he examined her aircraft. His voice came through the radio with barely concealed condescension. "Well, well." Jessica, in the pilot's seat. "How's it feel to play pretend?" She bit back. Her first response: "Aircraft is stable, all systems green." Front seat pilot remains unresponsive. "Yeah, I can see that. Also can see you're a little high on your altitude and drifting left. Might want to work on that." Jessica glanced at her instruments. Her altitude was exactly where it should be, her heading rock solid. Hayes was either testing her or genuinely couldn't read his own instruments properly. She suspected the latter. "My readings show on altitude and on heading," she replied evenly. "Are you questioning my assessment?" Hayes' voice carried an edge now. "Because last I checked, you were the one who got pulled from flight status for poor decision-making." The comment hit home, just as it was intended to. Jessica felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice level. "I'm just reporting what my instruments show." "Right. Your instruments. The ones you're not qualified to read in flight." Hayes moved his aircraft closer, close enough that Jessica could see his smirk through his visor. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to maintain current position while I coordinate with the tower. When we get you back to the carrier, you're going to taxi to the designated area and shut down. Then you're going to let qualified personnel handle the situation." Jessica said nothing. There was no point in arguing with Hayes. He was following protocol, and protocol didn't have provisions for observers taking control of aircraft. But something in his tone, the casual dismissal of her abilities, the assumption that she was playing dress-up in the cockpit, triggered something deeper than professional frustration. "You know," Hayes continued, apparently enjoying himself, "this is exactly the kind of stunt that got you benched in the first place. Can't follow simple instructions, can't accept your limitations. Some people just aren't cut out for this." "That's enough," Jessica said quietly. "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're having delusions of adequacy. You think because you can push some buttons and turn the wheel that you're actually flying this thing?" Jessica's hands tightened on the controls. Hayes was deliberately provoking her, trying to get an emotional response that would justify whatever disciplinary action was coming. She'd seen this pattern before, the way some people in positions of authority use their power to diminish others, to make themselves feel bigger by making others feel smaller. "My job is to get this aircraft and its crew safely back to the carrier," she said. "That's what I'm going to do. Your job is to sit in the back seat and keep your mouth shut. The fact that you're up there at all is only because Hayes never finished the sentence. His aircraft suddenly lurched violently to the left, engine sputtering. Jessica watched in horror as his FA-18 began to lose altitude, smoke trailing from the port engine. "Mayday, mayday." Hayes' voice cracked through the radio, all trace of arrogance gone. "Engine failure, losing altitude fast. I'm going to try to make it back to the carrier, but I don't think." The radio went dead. Jessica watched Hayes' aircraft spiral downward, her mind racing through options. The carrier was 90 nautical miles away, too far for a gliding approach with a dead engine. The ocean below was rough, with 20-foot swells that would make a water landing extremely dangerous. But there was another option. Jessica's aircraft was functioning perfectly, with plenty of fuel and all systems operational. She could escort Hayes back, provide radio relay if his communications were compromised, and potentially assist with navigation if his systems were damaged. "Tower, this is 509, she transmitted. "Chase plane is experiencing engine failure and has lost communications. I'm going to escort him back to the carrier. Negative, 509. You are not authorized to deviate from your assigned position. Maintain current heading and altitude." Jessica stared at the radio in disbelief. Hayes' aircraft was barely maintaining controlled flight, obviously in distress, and the tower was ordering her to maintain position. She looked down at the churning Pacific, imagining Hayes hitting the water at high speed in rough seas. Tower, that aircraft is going down. I can help guide him back. 509, you will maintain current position. That is a direct order. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Jessica realized that this was the moment she'd been building toward for months. Not just the chance to prove she could fly, but the choice between following orders and doing what was right. Hayes might be an arrogant jerk, but he was also a fellow pilot in trouble. She made her decision. Tower, I'm sorry, but I can't do that. Jessica banked left and dove toward Hayes' struggling aircraft, her mind already calculating intercept courses and fuel consumption rates. Behind her, the radio erupted in angry voices, orders and threats and warnings about consequences. She ignored them all. For the first time in months, she was exactly where she needed to be, in control of her own aircraft, making her own decisions, being the pilot she'd always known she could be. The chase plane was about to become the rescue mission, and Jessica was going to see it through, regardless of what happened to her afterward. Jessica's FA-18 cut through the afternoon sky like a knife, closing the distance to Hayes' crippled aircraft with precision that would have impressed her instructors. His port engine was completely dead, trailing wisps of smoke, and she could see him fighting to maintain level flight with reduced power and compromised aerodynamics. Hayes, this is Jessica, she transmitted on the emergency frequency. I'm on your 6. Can you hear me? Static filled the radio for several seconds before Hayes' voice came through, strained and barely audible. Jessica? What are you doing here? Tower said you were ordered to maintain position. Tower says a lot of things, Jessica replied, pulling alongside his aircraft. What's your status? Port engines completely dead. I'm losing hydraulic pressure, and my flight controls are getting sluggish. I don't think I can make it back to the carrier. Jessica studied his aircraft, noting the way it yawed slightly to the left, the uneven thrust from the remaining engine. She'd studied single-engine emergencies extensively, both in ground school and simulator training. The FA-18 could fly on one engine, but it required constant attention and precise control inputs. What's your fuel state? She asked. About 30 minutes at current consumption. Maybe less if I have to fight the controls much longer. 30 minutes. Jessica ran. The calculations in her head. The carrier was still 75 nautical miles away. At Hayes' reduced speed, with the headwind they were facing, it would take him at least 40 minutes to reach the deck. He was going to run out of fuel 20 minutes short of safety. Tower, this is 509. She transmitted. I'm with the distressed aircraft. He's not going to make it back on his current fuel state. 509, you were ordered to maintain position. Return to your assigned coordinates immediately. Jessica ignored the order. She was already mentally calculating alternatives. There was a small airstrip on one of the nearby islands, an emergency landing site that was rarely used but maintained for situations exactly like this. It was closer than the carrier, well within Hayes' fuel range. Hayes, what do you know about the emergency strip on Catalina Island? Not much. I know it exists, but I've never landed there. Is it long enough for an FA-18? Barely. But it's better than trying to ditch in the ocean. Jessica had studied every emergency airfield in the region, memorizing runway lengths, approach patterns, and hazards. The Catalina Strip was short and tricky, with crosswinds that could be challenging even for an experienced pilot. For someone flying a damaged aircraft with compromised controls, it would be extremely dangerous. But it was better than the alternative. 509, this is Commander Peterson. The familiar voice crackled through the radio. You are in direct violation of orders. Return to your assigned position immediately or face court-martial. Jessica's finger hovered over the radio switch. She could acknowledge the order, turn around, and let someone else deal with Hayes' emergency. It would be the safe choice, the career-preserving choice. She'd already risked enough by deviating from her assigned position. But Hayes was losing altitude, his aircraft becoming more unstable with each passing minute. The other rescue aircraft were still 30 minutes away, too far to provide meaningful assistance. She was the only pilot in position to help, and she had the knowledge and skills to make a difference. Commander Peterson, this is 509, she transmitted. I understand your position, but I have a pilot in distress who needs immediate assistance. I'm going to escort him to the emergency strip on Catalina Island. You are not authorized to make that decision. Maybe not, sir, but I'm the only one here who can make it. Jessica switched to the emergency frequency and began walking Hayes through the approach to Catalina Island. The strip was carved into the side of a mountain, with a steep approach over water and a short runway that dropped off into a cliff at the far end. It was the kind of landing that required absolute precision and nerves of steel. Okay, Hayes, listen carefully. The approach is going to be steep, steeper than anything you've done in training. You'll need to come in hot and high, then dump. Speed and altitude fast. The runway is only 4,000 feet long, and there's a cliff at the end. 4,000 feet? That's barely long enough for a normal landing, let alone a single-engine emergency. I know, but it's what we've got. Jessica guided Hayes through the approach, talking him through every step. She could see the strain in his voice, the way his aircraft wavered slightly as he fought to maintain control. The landing was going to be touch and go, but it was their only option. You're looking good, Hayes. Just hold your heading and trust your training. Easy for you to say. You're not the one flying a wounded bird. Actually, Jessica said, her voice carrying a hint of steel, I am. I've been flying wounded birds for months. The difference is that mine was wounded by other people's doubts instead of mechanical failure. Hayes went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, less arrogant, more respectful. Jessica, I owe you an apology. What? I said earlier, save it for after you're on the ground. Right now, just focus on flying. The emergency strip appeared ahead of them, a thin line of concrete carved into the mountainside. Jessica could see the crash equipment positioning itself, the emergency vehicles racing to intercept positions. The tower at Catalina had been alerted and was clearing the airspace. You're lined up perfect, Hayes. Just remember, steep approach. Dump speed fast, and don't be afraid to use the brakes. Copy that. And Jessica? Yeah, thanks for everything. Jessica watched Hayes' aircraft disappear behind the mountain, then listened to the radio chatter as he made his approach. The landing was rough. She could hear it in the tower controllers. Voice, but successful. Hayes was down safely, his aircraft intact, and he was walking away from what could have been a fatal accident. Tower, this is 509, she transmitted. Distressed aircraft is down safely at Catalina Island. Pilot is uninjured. The silence that followed was longer than usual. When Commander Peterson finally responded, his voice was carefully neutral. Copy, 509. You are ordered to return to the carrier immediately. And Jessica? Yes, sir? We'll deal with this when you get back. Jessica banked toward the carrier, her mind already turning to the consequences of her actions. She disobeyed direct orders, violated protocol, and probably ended any chance of getting her wings back. But Hayes was alive, and that was worth whatever came next. For the first time in months, Jessica felt like a pilot again. Not an observer, not a washout, but a pilot who'd made the hard decisions and lived with the consequences. Whatever happened next she could face it with her head held high. The debriefing room aboard the USS Constellation felt smaller than Jessica remembered. Commander Peterson sat across from her, his expression unreadable, while Captain Morrison stood near the porthole, arms crossed, studying the endless gray of the Pacific. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Peterson began, his voice carefully controlled. "You were ordered to maintain position while we coordinated a rescue operation. Instead, you chose to disobey those orders and conduct an unauthorized escort mission. That's correct, sir. And you made the decision to direct Lieutenant Hayes to an emergency landing strip without clearance from this vessel or from Naval Air Station Catalina Island. The strip was the closest safe landing option, sir. Hayes wouldn't have made it back to the carrier on his remaining fuel." Captain Morrison turned from the porthole, his weathered face serious. "Lieutenant Hayes has confirmed that assessment. He also stated that without your guidance, he wouldn't have been able to execute the landing safely." Jessica remained silent. She'd learned not to defend herself too vigorously. It often came across as argumentative rather than professional. "The problem," Peterson continued, "is that you're not qualified to make those kinds of decisions. You're an observer, not a pilot. Your flight status was revoked for good reason, was it?" Captain Morrison asked quietly. "Commander, have you reviewed the full incident report from her training accident?" Peterson looked uncomfortable. "I reviewed the summary, sir. Pilot showed poor judgment in a simulated emergency, refused to follow ejection protocol. Did you read the instructor's detailed analysis? The one that was buried in the appendix?" "I don't believe so, sir." Morrison walked to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. The instructor noted that her approach was unconventional, but technically sound. She calculated fuel consumption, wind factors, and glide ratios in real time. Her decision to attempt the landing was actually supported by the mathematics. Jessica blinked in surprise. She'd never seen that analysis, had never known it existed. Furthermore, Morrison continued, the instructor recommended additional training rather than removal from flight status. Someone in the chain of command overruled that recommendation. Peterson's jaw tightened. "Sir, with respect, the training pipeline has standards. We can't make exceptions for every pilot who thinks they know better than their instructors." "No," Morrison agreed. "But we also can't afford to lose pilots who demonstrate exceptional skill under pressure." Which brings us to today's incident. The captain opened another folder, this one containing radio transcripts and radar tracking data. Lieutenant Hayes' aircraft experienced a complete engine failure at 15,000 feet, 75 nautical miles from the carrier. Based on his fuel state and the headwind conditions, he had exactly zero chance of making it back to this vessel. He looked directly at Jessica. "Your decision to escort him to Catalina Island almost certainly saved his life. The question is whether that was luck or skill." Jessica found her voice. "Sir, I studied every emergency airfield in the region during my training. I knew the runway length, approach patterns, and hazards at Catalina. I wouldn't have recommended it if I didn't think it was viable." "And the approach guidance you provided?" Hayes was fighting damaged flight controls. "I walked him through the steep approach profile required for that particular runway. It's not standard procedure, but it's what the situation demanded." Morrison nodded slowly. "Commander Peterson, I want you to pull the flight data from today's incident. I want to see every control input, every navigation decision, every communication. I want to know exactly how skilled this observer really is." Peterson looked like he wanted to argue, but he simply nodded. "Yes, sir. There's something else," Morrison continued. "We've received a communication from Naval Air Station Catalina Island. They want to know who provided the approach guidance for Hayes' emergency landing. Apparently, it was textbook perfect. better than they've seen from pilots with thousands of hours of experience. Jessica felt something shift in the room, a subtle change in the dynamics. She'd spent months being treated like a failure, someone who couldn't measure up to the standards. Now, suddenly, her skills were being recognized. However, Morrison's voice grew serious. None of this changes the fact that you disobeyed direct orders. Military discipline exists for good reasons, and I can't simply ignore violations because they worked out well. Jessica's heart sank. She'd known this moment would come. I prepared herself for the consequences. But hearing it stated so clearly still stung. That said, the captain continued, extraordinary circumstances sometimes require extraordinary responses. The question is whether you acted out of arrogance or genuine necessity. He walked back to the porthole, gazing out at the darkening sky. I've been flying for 23 years, Lieutenant. I've seen pilots who follow orders blindly and get people killed. I've also seen pilots who think they're above regulations and get people killed. The trick is finding the ones who know the difference. Morrison turned back to face her. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to undergo a comprehensive flight evaluation. Not a simulation, but actual flight time. With our most experienced instructors. They're going to test every aspect of your flying abilities. If you pass, your flight status will be restored. Jessica felt her breath catch. Sir? If you fail, you'll be transferred to a ground position. No second chances. No appeals. This is it? Peterson looked stunned. Sir, is that wise? The training pipeline. The training pipeline failed to identify a pilot who just saved someone's life. Morrison interrupted. Maybe it's time we took a harder look at our evaluation methods. The captain stood, indicating the meeting was over. You'll start your evaluation tomorrow at 0600. Get some rest, Lieutenant. You're going to need it. Jessica stood and saluted, her mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. As she reached the door, Morrison called her name. Jessica? Yes, sir? That was good flying today. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As she walked through the corridors of the carrier, Jessica felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The evaluation would be grueling, designed to test every aspect of her abilities. But for the first time since her training accident, she had a real chance to prove herself. The stakes couldn't be higher. This was her last shot at the wings she'd dreamed of earning since childhood. But as she thought about Hayes' successful landing, about the lives that could be saved by skilled pilots willing to make hard decisions, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. The real test was just beginning. Dawn came early aboard the USS Constellation, but Jessica was already awake, had been for hours. She sat in the ready room with a cup of coffee gone cold, reviewing system diagrams and emergency procedures that she'd memorized months ago. The evaluation was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and she wasn't taking any chances. Commander Rebecca Walsh entered the room, her flight suit crisp and her expression serious. Walsh was a legend in naval aviation, one of the first female pilots to fly combat missions, with over 3,000 hours in the FA-18 and a reputation for being absolutely uncompromising when it came to flight standards. You ready for this? Walsh asked, settling into the chair across from Jessica. As ready as I'll ever be, ma'am. Walsh studied her for a moment. I've reviewed your file. Your training scores, your simulator performance, the incident report that got you benched. I've also read the analysis of yesterday's emergency escort mission. Jessica waited, not sure where this was leading. Here's what I see, Walsh continued. You're technically proficient, maybe more so than most pilots I've worked with. You understand systems. You can calculate performance parameters in your head, and you demonstrate good judgment under pressure. But you also have a history of making decisions that make your superiors nervous. Ma'am, I've always tried to do what I thought was right. I know. That's what makes you dangerous. Walsh leaned forward. The Navy wants pilots who can think, but we also need pilots who can follow orders. Sometimes those two things conflict. Today, we're going to find out which one you prioritize. They walked to the flight deck together, where a pristine FA-18 waited. The morning was clear, with light winds and unlimited visibility. Perfect conditions for a flight evaluation. Jessica performed her pre-flight inspection with meticulous care, checking every system, every connection, every potential failure point. "You're being thorough," Walsh observed. "I only get one shot at this, ma'am. Actually, you get several shots. We're going to run you through a series of scenarios. Basic maneuvers, emergency procedures, combat tactics. Each one is designed to test different aspects of your abilities." They climbed into the aircraft, Walsh taking the instructor's seat while Jessica settled into the pilot's position. For the first time in months, she was in the front seat, her hands on the primary controls, responsible for the aircraft's operation. "Tower, this is Hornet 7-1, ready for evaluation flight," Jessica transmitted. "Copy, 7-1. You are cleared for takeoff." The catapult launch was smooth and powerful, pressing Jessica back into her seat as the FA-18 accelerated. From 0 to 150 knots in 2 seconds. The carrier fell away beneath them, and suddenly they were airborne, climbing into the morning sky. "Let's start with basic maneuvers," Walsh said. "Show me a barrel roll." Jessica executed the maneuver with precision, maintaining altitude and airspeed throughout the roll. The aircraft responded smoothly to her inputs, and she felt the familiar satisfaction of flying well. "Good. Now let's try something harder. I want you to demonstrate a tactical approach to a simulated target. You'll have to stay below radar detection altitude while maintaining attack speed." The next hour passed in a blur of increasingly complex scenarios. Jessica flew low-level navigation routes, executed simulated combat maneuvers, and demonstrated air-to-air refueling techniques. With each successful completion, she felt her confidence growing. "Okay," Walsh said. "Now we get to the interesting part. I'm going to simulate a series of system failures. I want to see how you handle emergencies." The first failure was hydraulic pressure loss, a serious but manageable emergency that Jessica handled with textbook precision. She immediately switched to backup systems, adjusted her flight controls for the reduced responsiveness, and began calculating fuel consumption for an emergency landing. "Very good," Walsh noted. "Now let's try something more challenging." The next failure was more complex, a simulated engine fire combined with electrical system degradation. Jessica's training kicked in as she ran through the emergency checklist, shutting down the affected engine while managing the aircraft's balance and performance on reduced power. "Engine fire checklist complete," she reported. "Single engine approach procedures initiated." "Negative," Walsh said suddenly. "You're back up. Electrical system just failed. You've lost most of your navigation instruments, and your radio is intermittent." Jessica's heart rate increased, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was the kind of cascade failure that could quickly overwhelm even experienced pilots. She began flying by primary instruments only, using basic compass headings and altitude references to maintain control. "I'm navigating by dead reckoning," she reported, estimating position based on time and heading from last known coordinates. "The weather is deteriorating," Walsh continued, adding another layer of complexity. "Visibility dropping to 3 miles in haze. You need to find a carrier, but your homing beacon is offline." Jessica closed her eyes for a brief moment, visualizing the tactical situation. She'd memorized the carrier's patrol route, knew approximately where it should be based on time elapsed and standard operating procedures. But without instruments, she was essentially flying blind. I'm going to fly a search pattern based on the carrier's last known position, she decided. Standard square. Search, expanding outward until I acquire visual contact. For the next 20 minutes, Jessica flew the search pattern with mechanical precision, maintaining altitude and airspeed while scanning the horizon for any sign of the ship. Walsh remained silent, letting the scenario play out naturally. Finally, Jessica spotted a thin line on the horizon that looked different from the natural seascape. Contact, she announced. Possible vessel bearing 270, range approximately 15 miles. That's the carrier, Walsh confirmed. Now you need to land on it with degraded systems, reduced power, and marginal weather conditions. The approach was the most challenging flying Jessica had ever attempted. Without her normal instruments, she had to rely on visual references and her understanding of the aircraft's performance characteristics. The single engine provided just enough power for a controlled descent, but there was no margin for error. You're high and fast, Walsh observed as they approached the carrier. I know. I'm going to bleed speed with a steep descent, then level out at the last moment. That's a dangerous approach. One mistake and you'll either stall or overshoot the deck. It's the only approach that works with our current performance parameters, Jessica replied calmly. She executed the landing with surgical precision, touching down exactly on the center line and catching the third arrested wire. The aircraft came to a complete stop with room to spare, engines winding down as the deck crew rushed to secure the plane. Walsh was quiet for a long moment after they shut down. Finally, she turned to Jessica with an expression that was difficult to read. In 20 years of flight instruction, she said slowly, I've never seen anyone handle that scenario successfully. Most pilots would have declared an emergency and requested assistance. You solved it yourself. Jessica felt a surge of pride, but she kept her expression neutral. I had good training, ma'am. You had adequate training. What you did up there was pure flying ability combined with exceptional judgment. Walsh unstrapped her harness and prepared to climb out. There's one more test. Ma'am? Captain Morrison wants to see you in his office. There's someone there who wants to meet you. 20 minutes later, Jessica stood in Captain Morrison's office, still wearing her flight suit, facing a man she didn't recognize. He was older, maybe 50, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in military aviation. His uniform bore the insignia of a rear admiral. Lieutenant, this is Admiral Thompson, Morrison said. He's here from Naval Air Station Pensacola. He runs the Advanced Flight Training Program. Admiral Thompson studied Jessica with keen eyes. I've been hearing interesting things about you, Lieutenant. Your performance today, your handling of yesterday's emergency, your overall approach to flying. Commander Walsh tells me you have exceptional situational awareness and decision-making abilities. Thank you, sir. The Navy is always looking for pilots who can handle complex situations independently. We have a new program developing designed to train pilots for special operations missions. It requires people who can think outside normal parameters while maintaining absolute precision in execution. Jessica felt her pulse quicken. This sounded like something beyond her wildest expectations. However, Thompson continued, the program is extremely demanding. The failure rate is over 60%, and those who don't make it are typically assigned to ground positions permanently. Are you interested? Jessica looked at Captain Morrison, then back at Admiral Thompson. 3 months ago, she'd been labeled as having poor judgment and questionable decision-making abilities. Now, she was being offered a chance at one of the most elite programs in naval aviation. Sir, I'm very interested. Good. You'll report to Pensacola in 2 weeks for evaluation and initial training. Pack for an extended stay. If you're selected, the program runs for 8 months. As Admiral Thompson left, Captain Morrison walked over to his desk and picked up a small box. Before you go, there's one more thing. He opened the box to reveal a set of naval aviator wings, the golden insignia she'd been working toward for so long. Your flight status is hereby restored, Morrison said formally. Welcome back to the cockpit, Lieutenant. Jessica accepted the wings with hands that trembled slightly. The weight of them was exactly as she'd imagined, the metal cool against her palm. After months of doubt and setbacks, she was finally where she belonged. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. You earned these today, and yesterday, and probably months ago if we'd been paying closer attention. As Jessica pinned the wings to her flight suit, she thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The failures, the doubts, the people who tried to convince her she wasn't good enough. All of it had led to this, not just the restoration of her flight status, but the opportunity to prove herself at the highest levels of naval aviation. The real adventure was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Jessica stood in Admiral Thompson's office at Naval Air Station Pensacola, but the conversation wasn't going the way she'd expected. Across from her sat Commander Bradley, the same pilot she'd rescued from the FA 18 weeks earlier, when he'd lost consciousness during their routine patrol. His face was flushed with barely controlled anger. Sir, with all due respect, I have serious concerns about Lieutenant Reynolds' inclusion in this program, Bradley was saying, his voice tight with frustration. Admiral Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying both officers. Go on, Commander. She has a documented history of insubordination. During our flight together, she took unauthorized control of the aircraft. Then, when ordered to maintain position during the Hayes emergency, she flagrantly disobeyed direct orders. Jessica remained silent, but her jaw tightened. Bradley was twisting the events to paint her in the worst possible light. Furthermore, Bradley continued, her decision-making process is fundamentally flawed. She prioritizes personal judgment over established protocol. That kind of cowboy mentality has no place in special operations. Admiral Thompson turned to Jessica. How do you respond to these allegations? Jessica took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Sir, Commander Bradley was unconscious during our flight together. I took control of the aircraft because he was medically incapacitated and unable to perform his duties. As for the Hayes incident, I made a tactical decision based on the information available to me at the time. A tactical decision? Bradley's voice rose. You were ordered to maintain position. There's no ambiguity in that command. Hayes was going to die, Jessica said simply. His aircraft was crippled. He was running out of fuel, and he was too far from the carrier to make it back safely. I was the only pilot in position to help him. That wasn't your call to make. Then whose call was it? Jessica turned to face Bradley directly. The rescue aircraft were 30 minutes away. Hayes had maybe 20 minutes of fuel. Should I have maintained position and watched him crash into the ocean? Admiral Thompson raised a hand, stopping the argument. Commander Bradley, I've read the incident reports. Lieutenant Hayes has stated unequivocally that Lieutenant Reynolds saved his life. The emergency landing at Catalina Island was executed flawlessly, despite challenging conditions. Sir, that's not the point. Military discipline exists for a reason. If we allow pilots to ignore orders whenever they think they know better, we get pilots who can think independently and solve problems, Thompson interrupted. Which is exactly what special operations requires. Bradley's face darkened. Sir, I've known Jessica since flight training. She's always been a hothead, always thought she was smarter than her instructors. The incident that got her benched proves my point perfectly. Does it? Thompson opened a folder on his desk. I've reviewed that incident extensively. The simulation involved multiple system failures and adverse weather conditions. Her instructor recommended additional training, not removal from flight status. Someone higher up the chain overruled that recommendation. He looked directly at Bradley, someone who felt that her unconventional approach demonstrated poor judgment, despite the fact that she successfully completed the landing. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. The training pipeline has standards. The training pipeline failed to recognize exceptional ability, Thompson said coldly. Let me ask you something, Commander. During your years as an instructor, how many students did you recommend for removal from flight status? I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. Bradley hesitated. Perhaps a dozen, maybe 15. And how many of those removals were later overturned upon review? None, sir. Interesting. Because according to my records, you've had an unusually high rate of washing out female pilots. In fact, 70% of the women who've trained under you have been removed from the program. The room fell silent. Jessica stared at Admiral Thompson, pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. Bradley's hostility toward her, his dismissive comments, his determination to see her fail. It hadn't been about her flying ability at all. Sir, I resent the implication, Bradley said stiffly. My evaluations are based solely on performance and aptitude. Are they? Because I've also spoken with several other instructors who worked with Lieutenant Reynolds. They describe her as one of the most naturally gifted pilots they've ever seen. They were surprised when she was removed from flight status. Thompson stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the flight line where training aircraft practiced touch-and-go landings. Here's what I think happened, he said without turning around. A talented pilot made an unconventional decision. That worked. Her instructor recognized her ability and recommended continued training. But someone else, someone with authority over the training pipeline, decided that she represented a threat to the established order. He turned back to face Bradley. Someone who believed that certain types of people don't belong in fighter cockpits. Bradley's face was stone. Sir, my evaluations have always been fair and objective. Have they? Because I've done some digging into your background, Commander. Your service record shows a pattern of conflicts with female subordinates. 3 formal complaints filed against you for gender discrimination, all quietly resolved through transfers and reassignments. Jessica felt her breath catch. She'd never known about any complaints, had never suspected that Bradley's treatment of her was part of a larger pattern. Those complaints were investigated and dismissed, Bradley said defensively. They were buried, Thompson corrected, swept under the rug to avoid embarrassing the service. But I've spoken with the women involved. Their stories are remarkably consistent. Admiral Thompson returned to his desk and picked up another folder. Commander Bradley, you're being transferred to a ground position, effective immediately. Your days of evaluating pilot candidates are over. Bradley's face went white. Sir, you can't. I can and I am. You've damaged too many careers, wasted too much talent. The Navy can't afford that kind of prejudice, especially not in leadership positions. Bradley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is a mistake, sir. You're promoting someone who can't follow orders, who thinks she's above military discipline. No, Thompson said quietly. I'm correcting a mistake that should never have been made in the first place. As Bradley stormed out of the office, slamming the door. Behind him, Admiral Thompson turned to Jessica with an expression of genuine regret. Look, Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. The Navy failed you, and I'm sorry for that. Bradley's prejudices should never have been allowed to affect your career. Jessica felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. She'd finally learned the truth about why her career had been derailed. But the knowledge came with the understanding of how many other women had suffered similar treatment. What happens now, sir? Now you get the opportunity you should have had months ago. The Special Operations Program is yours if you want it. No more obstacles, no more prejudice. just the chance to prove yourself at the highest levels. Jessica thought about all the months of doubt, the questioning of her own abilities, the assumption that she wasn't good enough to meet the Navy standards. All of it had been based on one man's inability to accept that women could be just as skilled, just as brave, and just as valuable as their male counterparts. "I want it, sir." "Good. Report to the training facility tomorrow at 0600. "And Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir. I have a feeling you're going to exceed everyone's expectations." As Jessica left the Admiral's office, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The truth about Bradley's discrimination didn't erase the months of frustration and self-doubt, but it provided clarity about what she'd been fighting against. She wasn't just proving herself anymore. She was breaking down barriers for every woman who would follow in her footsteps. 6 months later, Lieutenant Jessica Reynolds stood on the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, watching the sun rise over the South China Sea. Her flight suit bore new patches, now the distinctive insignia of the Navy's elite special operations squadron, earned through 8 grueling months of the most demanding training program in naval aviation. The morning briefing had covered their current mission, a complex search and rescue operation in hostile waters, requiring precision flying under challenging conditions. It was exactly the kind of mission that the Special Operations Program had trained her for, and she felt ready. "Reynolds," a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Lieutenant Commander Price approaching, his expression serious but respectful. Price had been one of the pilots who'd initially dismissed her abilities, but months of working together had changed his perspective. "Yes, sir?" "Admiral Thompson wants to see you before the mission briefing. Something about a special assignment." Jessica made her way to the Admiral's temporary office aboard the Lincoln, wondering what kind of special assignment could be important enough to interrupt mission preparation. She found Thompson reviewing flight plans with several other senior officers. "Ah, Jessica, come in." Thompson gestured to a chair. "I have some news that I think you'll find interesting." He handed her a folder marked with the seal of the Naval War College. "You've been selected to attend the Advanced Strategic Studies program. It's a 1-year course that prepares officers for senior leadership positions." Jessica stared at the folder, hardly believing what she was seeing. The War College program was highly competitive, typically reserved for officers being groomed for flag rank. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm just a lieutenant." "Isn't this program usually for commanders and captains?" Thompson smiled. "Usually, yes. But the selection board was impressed by your performance evaluations and your approach to problem solving under pressure. They want to fast-track officers who demonstrate exceptional leadership potential." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "There's something else. The Navy is implementing new policies regarding discrimination and bias in the training pipeline. Your case and Bradley's misconduct has prompted a complete review of evaluation procedures." Jessica felt a surge of satisfaction. Her struggle hadn't been in vain if it led to changes that would help other women succeed. What happened to Commander Bradley? He was quietly retired from active duty. His conduct review found a pattern of discriminatory behavior that couldn't be ignored. Several of the women he'd wrongfully removed from training have been offered the opportunity to return to flight status. Thompson stood and walked to the porthole, gazing out at the flight deck where aircraft were being prepared for the day's missions. "You know, when I first heard about your case, I thought it was just another personality conflict between an instructor and a student. It wasn't until I dug deeper that I realized how systemic the problem was." He turned back to face her. Bradley wasn't an isolated case. There are others throughout the system, people who let their prejudices affect their professional judgment. But change is coming. A knock at the door interrupted them. An aide entered with a message for Admiral Thompson, who read it quickly and frowned. "It seems we have a developing situation," he said. "One of our search and rescue helicopters has gone down in rough seas about 200 miles northwest of here. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and the standard rescue aircraft don't have the range to reach them." Jessica felt her pulse quicken. "What about the Special Operations Squadron?" "That's exactly what I was thinking. We need someone who can navigate in marginal conditions, execute a precision rescue under pressure, and bring everyone home safely." Thompson looked at her meaningfully. "Interested?" Jessica thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The simulation that had nearly ended her career, the months of doubt and frustration, the discovery of Bradley's discrimination, and the grueling training that had prepared her for exactly this kind of mission. "Yes, sir, absolutely." 30 minutes later, Jessica was strapped into the cockpit of an FA-18 Super Hornet, leading a two-aircraft formation toward the rescue site. The weather was challenging. Low clouds, gusty winds, and poor visibility, but well within her capabilities. Her wingman was Lieutenant Hayes, the same pilot she'd helped save months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their roles had essentially reversed. "How are you feeling about this, Jessica?" Hayes asked over the radio. "Confident," she replied. "We've trained for scenarios exactly like this." The rescue site was worse than the briefing had indicated. 20-foot swells, driving rain, and visibility limited to less than a mile. The downed helicopter was barely visible in the churning seas, its crew clinging to life rafts that were being tossed around like toys. "This is going to be tricky," Hayes observed. "The rescue swimmer will have to deploy in some pretty rough conditions." Jessica studied the tactical situation, calculating wind patterns, wave heights, and approach angles. The standard rescue procedure called for a stable hover while the swimmer was deployed, but the weather made that nearly impossible. "I have an idea," she transmitted. "What if we use a running approach instead of a hover? Come in low and fast, deploy the swimmer on a cable, then climb out before the waves can affect our rotor wash." "That's not standard procedure." "No, it's not. But standard procedure won't work in these conditions." There was a pause while Hayes considered the proposal. Finally, he responded, "You're the mission commander. It's your call." Jessica smiled, remembering all the times she'd been told that various decisions weren't her call to make. Now, finally, they were. The rescue went exactly as planned. The running approach allowed them to deploy the swimmer safely despite the rough seas, and within minutes they had all 4 helicopter crew members aboard their aircraft. The flight back to the carrier was routine, but the satisfaction Jessica felt was anything but ordinary. As they touched down on the Lincoln's deck, Jessica realized that this was what she'd been working toward all along. Not just the chance to fly, but the opportunity to lead, to make the decisions that saved lives and completed missions. Admiral Thompson was waiting for her when she climbed out of the cockpit. "Outstanding work," he said simply. That was exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need in our senior officers. Later that evening, Jessica stood alone on the flight deck, watching the stars emerge as the last light faded from the western sky. In her hand was a letter from one of the women who'd been wrongfully removed from flight training during Bradley's tenure. She was returning to the program, determined to earn her wings despite the setbacks she'd faced. The letter reminded Jessica that her struggle had been about more than just her own career. Every barrier she'd broken down, every precedent she'd set, made it easier for the women who would follow. Her radio crackled with the voice of the flight operations officer. "Lieutenant Reynolds, you have a call from Naval Personnel Command." Jessica made her way to the communication center, wondering what new assignment or opportunity might be waiting for her. But when she picked up the phone, the voice on the other end surprised her. "Jessica? This is Captain Morrison from the Constellation. I wanted to congratulate you on your promotion." "Promotion, sir? Check your message traffic." You've been selected for early promotion to lieutenant commander. The board was unanimous. They said they'd never seen such outstanding leadership potential in such a young officer. As Jessica hung up the phone, she thought about the simulation that had started it all, the moment when she'd chosen to trust her judgment over established protocol. That decision had cost her months of frustration and self-doubt, but it had also led her to this moment. She was no longer fighting for recognition or struggling against discrimination. She was leading missions, training new pilots, and helping to change the culture of naval aviation for the better. The stars above reflected off the calm seas, and for the first time in years, Jessica felt completely at peace with her place in the world. She'd found her wings, proven her worth, and opened doors for others to follow. The best part was that this was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.